there, and welcome back to MR Realities. This is a podcast that my good friend Kevin Gray up in Tokyo and me, based here in not so sunny Bangkok today, do, where we talk to experts on the market research field around the world about what's happening with market research, marketing, and what we think is going to be happening in the future. Kevin, do you want to talk about our guest today?
Well, we're going to let Graeme Read do most of the talking. He's, as he will explain to us, and I think it'll come out in the course of our discussions, a real veteran in medical marketing research. So anyway, with that brief introduction, could you perhaps fill in some of the blanks on what you do, where you came from, how long you've been in medical marketing research and related stuff? Graeme?
Sure thing. Yeah. Well, thanks, Dave and Ken. I look forward to this conversation. It's a good opportunity to share my views after many years in the marketing side of the business. Look, I've been in the life science, health and wellness industries coming on about 30 years now in sales and marketing, advertising, communications, and even dabbled in public health and social marketing. Spent a good chunk of that time with McCann Health across a number of continents and countries, New Zealand, Australia, up here in Singapore, China, India, and the UK, across a range of commercial and strategic planning roles, primarily strategic planning. The most recent of which was heading up the region as president for Asia Pacific, running a team of 600 specialist folk across 12 offices. I've led strat planning for global, regional, and domestic businesses and brands in pharma, consumer health, nutrition, nutraceuticals, medical devices, diagnostics, healthcare services, hospitals, med tech, vaccines, natural remedies. It's a very broad area. And in addition to that, behavioral change programs and social marketing and public health, all of which have benefited immensely from decent market research. I've got a really strong passion for what I call life-changing ideas that improve the health of humanity. And I'm driven by a commitment to help any health and wellness brand play a more meaningful role in people's lives, which is where, of course, market research comes into play, proper market research, I should say. And by people, we also include doctors in that mix. How do we get brands to be more meaningful in their day-to-day lives as healthcare professionals? On a personal level, I'm a Kiwi. I'm now based back in Singapore again and thoroughly enjoying my new life as an independent strategic consultant in life sciences, health and wellness. Actually, I should mention also that Dave and I have got a bit of history. When I first moved to Singapore in 1996 to open McCann Health, I was the only healthcare comms person in a mainline agency here in Singapore. And that meant I was working closely with the consumer agency. And I got to know a few folk, including Dave, who took a keen interest in what we're doing in health. And Dave was based then in Bangkok. I know you're back in Bangkok now, but you've spent many years away from Bangkok. And he was the creator of a concept called Pulse, which essentially kept a pulse on the consumer. And this is it was groundbreaking stuff because it was conducted independently of brand assignment. So it was really regular insight work. And I immediately recognized the value that could bring to our health work. The pulse of the aging population, the pulse of young folk, the pulse of healthcare professionals. So Dave kindly brought me into the fold as the healthcare champion within the McCann APAC Pulse program. And then we leveraged it for many years across pharma, consumer health, nutrition, natural remedies, and so on. So look, thanks again, guys, for the opportunity to join you today.
Well, we're very, very pleased to have you. This is going to be a very interesting discussion because, there's been, everybody in and around marketing and marketing research is vaguely aware of medical marketing and medical marketing research, but there haven't been that many people really have anything close to your level and extent and depth and breadth of experience. So we're very happy to have you. And there are a number of things that we could talk about. Our time, unfortunately, is limited to just about 40 minutes. But just to start off, so, you mentioned that you have been in the business for about 30 years. So flashing back 30 years, how were things then compared to now? How have things changed in medical marketing and marketing research?
Yeah, good question. I should start by saying that I'm not a market researcher. I haven't worked in a market research company. I'm an ad guy, essentially.
Yeah.
But a massive fan of good market research because it informs all stages of the process. And
you're a consumer of it.
I'm a consumer of it, and also, I guess, a commissioner of it in many respects. I've worked very closely with enough market research partners to know what good looks like, and we're not seeing enough of the good these days, unfortunately. So yes, it's from the point of view of a market researcher user, and in many cases a sort of a co-commissioner of market research along with clients. Look, I think all was good with healthcare market research up until maybe a decade or 15 years ago, and since then we've seen and I'm talking really from an Asia Pacific perspective. I know there's some global truths in this, but one of the biggest impacts I think we've seen is budget, lean budgets, a dramatic decrease in investment in marketing across the board. This is primarily in pharma. We see, consumer health still moving along quite nicely, but in pharma, there's far fewer blockbusters now. A lot of our work used to be around pre-launch, launch, and post-launch of, the big pharma brands where you'd get annual brand assignments. You'd be working in partnership with other stakeholders like the PR agencies, the market research agencies. We just don't see that anymore. Fewer blockbusters, increased generics, country sort of governmental healthcare budgets under pressure. So the global pharma teams have sort of taken the lead in many respects on global work, and often guidance and assets are provided directly to local markets, often skipping the regional headquarters. And a lot of the Singapore-based business, where a lot of the sort of market research, healthcare specialized firms are based, have lost a lot of that regional healthcare budget. It goes global to local, and the appetite for sort of redoing, I guess, what's been done at a global level has become less and less. I'd rather pour that money into producing stuff for the healthcare professionals and the patients. And one of the first things to go, unfortunately, is market research in terms of budget decreases.
So this trend then, or these trends began before the GFC?
Look, I think it all started then, to be honest with you. I think up until then, we saw big investment in marketing as a comms agency and certainly market research. I think connected to budget decrease has been a decreased investment in talent in client companies. There's been a corresponding drop in seniority and experience. And somehow the discipline, I think, of market research has been lost. There's a long decision-making process. There's multiple stakeholders. It's very much procurement-led. It used to be marketing-led. And we see a lot of clients wanting to do sort of in-house research. They've got a panel of friendly doctors or a patient pool or some key opinion leaders. And of course, they get skewed insight. They get sort of what they want to hear as opposed to what's really going on in the mind of the target audience. And so, I think budget cuts, talent cuts, and as a result, market research is no longer a guaranteed part of the mix. And I think it's sort of ironical that it's the comms agencies that are going to clients with proposals saying, market research is an essential part of the mix here. The insights you've given us are lackluster. They're not really insights at all. We don't have enough to go on. We can't do our work without a deeper understanding into the market and the customer. And so on, and often it'll become a quick dipstick. It'll be something that the agency will conduct, sort of out of desperation almost, and often unpaid, just to get some substance behind the strategies that are being proposed. And then that becomes par for course. It becomes, well, you did some dipstick research last time. Can you not do it again?
Yeah, so it becomes sort of that continuation of bad practice. Graeme, I don't want to, interrupt you, but I just was reminded of something that happened only a few weeks ago, and it's a sort of compliment to you. I was in a meeting with a OTC pharma company, doing a one-day session with them, and towards the beginning of the day, I asked the silly question about, what kind of audit have you done of the research you've done in recent years? And somebody in the room said, oh, yeah, well, we use this a lot. And they actually put up a hard copy of a thing called, I think it was called The Truth About Doctors, the study that you helped lead.
Oh, yeah, the McCann.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, first of all, I can't remember how old that was off the top of my head. But I guess it must be a few years old now, right?
Yeah, it's 3 or 4 years old.
Yeah. But what got me was that this was the market research. Was a generic, it was a very interesting study for the listeners. Graeme could explain more, but basically, it was a look at what was practices and beliefs from doctors in, around Asia sort of thing. But what was interesting was the fact that this company sort of like held this up as, yeah, we've done market research, we've read this. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's like a generic study about doctors across the region, not even specializing in the area that these people specialized in. And it was that scary moment when I went, is that all? And pretty much they all looked at each other and went, yeah. Scary.
We can take that as a compliment, but it's a little frightening, isn't it?
Well, good for you that they'd actually, it's always good for me when I see friends, I don't mean generic in a bad way, but,
Of course, absolutely.
A region-wide point of view study based on, some interviews and stuff like that. It's a good piece of research, but first of all, it's very general, to be used as a very deep, way in the background piece, not as, well, this is the research we've done. But that led me to the question, I know that since you have set up shop and you're sort of doing a lot of consulting on your own, what happens when you start in a project? You get asked to consult with a company and you go, well, what research have you done? What's the sort of typical response that you get?
Well, it's either non-existent in many cases, or it's a global study that included some of the markets that the client may be responsible for.
Yeah.
It generally is lacking in real insight. I can't count the number of times where, in the brief, I guess, and this is reflecting back also on my time in the agency, the insight presented, which is meant to be the thrust of the thinking, is not insight at all. It's really taking the client back to sort of marketing 101 and defining what is an insight and why is an insight so important, and why we need to, deeply understand the customer context, the market context, competitive context, the culture, and so on, in order to build a robust strategy. And I think part of it also is, unlike consumer, where you wouldn't keep your job if you didn't understand the basic tenet of marketing and insights and the role of market research. It's almost like they feel they know their doctors well enough, and it's often at a very rational level.
Right.
So the need to go deeper and to sort of look at the human being behind the white coat, and
I think I've talked about this with other guests on different podcasts in this series, but I know you and I have talked about this before, and I know you've done quite a bit of work in that, in trying to understand or get people to understand that doctors are people. So doctors make often the decisions, whether it's a doctor, pharmacist, whatever, they make decisions based on things that have nothing to do with their credentials necessarily, right? So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think in pharma, and I guess if we focus the conversation on pharma for simplicity, I guess, there tends to be a primary focus on the rational attributes of the product, what the product does, its mode of action, the benefits that patients derive, and so on and so forth. So any market research conducted by a client will tend to zoom straight into conversations around that, and the doctor's attitudes and feelings towards the product, how it works, the disease, the patients, and so on and so forth. There's often less attention paid to the broader context of the doctor's life and the role they're playing, their relationship with the patient, how that disease makes them feel, the impact of the disease on patients' lives, the degree to which the doctor feels he or she can control that or can have a meaningful intervention. There's a lot of rich territory in there to explore if it's done well, but the brief to agencies and often to market research companies is to get straight into the sort of rational aspects of those conversations, and as a consequence, you don't get those richer insights. I mean, a good example would be, there's been a recent, splurge of interest in understanding the patient journey and understanding, how they get to a prescription. It's still a very rational process in the mind of many stakeholders. I noticed my symptoms. I Googled, those symptoms. I possibly went to the pharmacy and got some self-medication. I visited a doctor, he diagnosed me, he treated me, and now I'm taking my treatment. So it's a very physical journey from A to Z, but not often do we see people delving into the patient experience. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are they doing? Which is where the real opportunities lie for companies to engage.
I'm wondering, isn't that part of a long-standing criticism of the medical profession, though, that they are they lack the bedside manners, many doctors?
Well, possibly that could be a patient perspective on the doctor, but doctors, there's a lot of emotional territory to play with. I think if the research is done well, and you can delve into how these guys really feel about, and this will vary by patient type, by disease type, by life stage. There's a lot to play with in there. Maybe I could illustrate with an example, perhaps. There was a client in Europe, which was an anesthesia client, and typically that type of product is sold by, you show the bottle, you stick it on top of what looks like a high-tech machine, and you put 3 or 4 bullet points next to it, and the virtues of the product, essentially. So as we managed to convince the client to do some proper insight work, and as we delved into the conversations with the anaesthetists, we discovered that, these are the guys that sit in the corner of an operating room, tampering with machines. No one ever talks to them. And the hero in the room is the surgeon. He comes in, he expects the patient to be anaesthetized, he wants no twitching, he wants the patient lying perfectly still, he's surrounded by nurses, he does his job and he leaves. And it's actually the anaesthetist that keeps that patient alive. So we sort of understood that, they wanted to be more of a hero in the room. They were feeling left out, they were feeling undervalued, not respected, a bit annoyed that the surgeon gets all the glory. And what was quite nice, that opened a really nice opportunity for the brand, which provided, in terms of its rational features, more certainty and more predictability. It gave the chance for the doctor to demonstrate his mastery, to become, the master of the trade, and to demonstrate his expertise in front of others and become the hero in the room. So, it was a nice way to leverage that deep-seated emotional feeling the doctor had about his role relative to others, and connect an attribute for the brand which was otherwise dull and boring and very rational and not too different from the competition, to a much more emotive platform. That was the first time an anesthetic brand had really developed a proper insight-driven strategy and creative and human-type communication to a healthcare professional.
Yeah, I think it's part of the training. It's so intense that it is factual, it is science, and even though people working in healthcare, I think, are very emotional people, more passionate, more so than most of us, they're trained to kind of keep this inside, right? So that's something perhaps you're banging into.
Well, yeah, look, it's the old rational and emotional. I think in the world of pharma, rational seems to come to the forefront. It's probably, I guess, the place where people feel more comfortable because they've got products with clinical data, they've got points of difference, and I think that's the challenge, because nowadays there is a very little difference between one product and another. I mean, gone are the days, the blockbuster days where products came to market with a truly meaningful and very distinct difference from the nearest competitor. And when they came to market, they had 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 years exclusivity before the nearest competitor came. That's no longer the case. The differences between products are marginal, just marginal data points. And the timing between the launch of one product and the next can be as short as 6 months. So, so trying to have clients understand that, the rational is easily superseded, the emotional is enduring. And if you're able to build that emotional bond and that emotional difference and that connection, underpinned by all of that data and the science, we're not foregoing that. It's just, it's the combination, and it's the emotional piece that needs decent market research and decent techniques.
As you're talking, Graeme, I'm reminded a week or so ago I was in Europe at a conference, AI and the health industry, and but at a lunchtime discussion, I was talking to a group of people, including one guy who was an AI ethicist, for what that's worth. But the discussion around the lunch was interesting because it touched on something that relates to what you're talking about, which is it got talking about that TV show, The Good Doctor, which is a big hit around the world at the moment. But then actually we ended up talking about everything from sort of Dr. Kildare and Marcus Welby through to The Good Doctor, and the fact that, we could all rattle off a dozen doctor-related or doctor-centric TV shows, but those doctor-centric TV shows are all about the highly emotional state of the doctors and nurses, and in most cases about the huge amount of empathy and emotional-driven reaction to life that they have. And yet at the same time, we sort of have there's this culture that exists that, doctors are all about science and rationality, and they don't really care about sort of thing. Or there's that urban myth that is there. And I wonder, just, in terms of the research you've done and your things, how do you see patients reacting to the impression they have of doctors, and what they expect from doctors, etc.? Yeah,
look, and I think if you look back at that study you referred to earlier, Dave, and the truth about doctors, that really highlighted a big shift. I think what's really happened is that the doctor is no longer central to a consumer's healthcare ecosystem. He or she is just a cog in the wheel now. A decade or more ago, it was doctor at the center, the custodian of all health knowledge, the custodian of the patient's health and well-being. Now, he or she is just one component that encompasses a range of other sources for the patient to derive their healthcare knowledge and support. Pharmacists, the internet, peers, social media, non-doctor key opinion leaders that are influencing them, and so on. And doctors feel that. They feel that they're no longer valued as much as they used to be. They're just a cog in the wheel. They're no longer, the custodians of all health knowledge. Machines and algorithms can now replace decision-making in many respects. And in the study you referred to, there was a point there around this shift from being in a caring business to being in the business of care. And that really talks to the sort of economic pressures that physicians are facing. I mean, they got into this business to care for patients, and now they're measured in 5-minute blocks in terms of how much time they can spend with the patient. So it's become a business of care. So there's a lot of pressure, and the whole tenet of that particular study was their doctorness is under threat. What makes them a doctor? What the reason they got into being a doctor, and it's a lot to do with patient respect, patient relationships, how they're perceived, is under serious threat, and they feel that.
So tell me more about the mechanics of using Google, Siri, Alexa, as a medical, as you sort of medical advisor these days. You find that how are companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the different companies that clients you deal with, how are they taking that on board?
Well, look, I think there was a period where they sort of ignored it to some extent, and it was I guess a propagation of all the downsides to these technologies in terms of spreading misinformation, which to a large extent remains true. But I think the fact is there is access online to credible sources of information. There's virtual doctors. There's mechanisms for getting good medical insight information by patients directly before and after consulting their healthcare professional. What these sources don't provide, I guess, is the human touch, and what a doctor is meant to provide that a machine never can is empathy. In some cases, humor, or the ability to provide that sort of personalized human connection, I suppose. But I think what companies are thinking about is how do they now sort of leverage what is now the first port of call for healthcare for consumers. And, you can't push it away. So companies are wanting to be part of that ecosystem where, consumers have access to, or patients have access to their knowledge via virtual sources.
Right. I heard in one workshop I was in, somebody talking about the fact that, fair enough, they were saying, look, as part of their marketing, we need to rewrite what appears on Google about our product and about what we're doing to make it more accessible to people, and that's probably good. Employ a better copywriter sort of thing. Maybe employ somebody like you, Graeme, to relook at it. But then they got onto Siri, and it was sort of like, now, wouldn't it be great if we could arrange it so that Siri answered the questions in the voice of whichever your favourite TV doctor was?
Yeah.
Which actually may not be such a bad idea, right? As far as empathy goes, at least if you could hear, I don't know, whoever's Marcus Welby's voice. I'm saying Marcus Welby, and then maybe thinking I might be the only person that ever listens to this podcast that remembers who Marcus Welby was.
Well, I certainly do.
Oh, thank God, Kevin. Yeah, thank you.
And Dr. Kildare, too.
Because I know Graham's sitting there going, what the hell are you talking about?
Well, I mean, that sort of leads neatly into a question I was meaning to ask, and that is, since, we've got one American and an Aussie and a Kiwi, talking about American TV shows, and I guess a British TV show as well, too. For someone who is new to marketing in this area, and they are coming out to APAC, or conversely from APAC to another part of the world, what are sort of the cultural differences or other differences in systems, the way medical systems operate? Anything that's relevant that you think that they should know? A short list, of course. I'm sure they don't have to for 3 days on it, but
that is a whole separate topic for sure. But I think the big thing is the diversity of systems. I think if you're coming from a lot of the sort of regional marketeers that we would find in this part of the world are coming out of, say, the UK or the US or Australia. They're coming from a healthcare system they're very familiar with. Coming into APAC, you're looking at 20 plus healthcare systems, all of which have their own idiosyncrasies. I think, and it would be a rather large conversation probably to go through what those differences are. Private markets, public markets, you've got funded, non-funded drugs, and so on. but I think what we endeavour to do is obviously look for the similarities. And again, where market research comes into play is we're dealing with an incredibly diverse region in terms of healthcare professionals, consumers, health systems, and so on. But those overarching cultural or human truths that are going to drive a brand proposition should sit above all of that. And the best examples of good work is where we've managed to find the commonalities. And again, that study that Dave referred to earlier was seeking to find some global truths around healthcare professionals, but also some regional truths. Because I think part of the challenge in this part of the world, particularly if you're running a regional team, is trying to align all of those disparate markets. And so when the regional marketeers come in from their singular market system, and they suddenly encounter 17 or 18 different systems here in Asia Pacific, how do you get all of those independent marketeers to agree to something? And often, if you can get them to agree to a killer insight or something that sort of unifies the healthcare professional or the patient mindset or situation, that's a great starting point to try and bring everyone together.
Yeah, because you could just drown in the differences. I mean, you can.
Oh, absolutely.
It's nice. If you're an academic anthropologist, that's one thing. But with all these, as you say, you have. There's so many facets to this. You have the legal systems, the way they're structured, traditions and culture, language, all of that. So it's not an easy task.
Actually, just Dave was picking up on the point earlier around the health consumer and accessing information online. I think this is part of a bigger story around the empowered health consumer. I think the consumer is at the centre of their own healthcare ecosystem. Doctors just a cog. But I was speaking with a lady called Felicia Hugh from an agency here called Assembled, market research agency, and she was telling me that a lot of research recently has been focused on improving the patient experience throughout that journey that we spoke about. And this is pharma-driven research, so they're increasingly now interested in, sort of paying some attention to the healthcare professional, but now more importantly almost is what is the patient experience as they journey towards a prescription or towards a particular treatment. And they've gone so far as to, she's run a number of sessions for pharma companies involving global and regional leadership where they meet with patients, they try to build some empathy, and almost they're trying now to reconnect with patients as part of their role as pharmaceutical marketeers. And the focus on the healthcare professional has also moved into caregivers, facilities, counsellors, and so on and so forth. So almost like allied healthcare professionals. So I think pharma are realising that, with the patient at the centre of their own healthcare ecosystem, they need to understand that ecosystem a lot better beyond the healthcare professional. So there's been a big tendency to move sort of market research dollars, if you like, into those sorts of areas, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I've just noticed, mostly because of a couple of friends of mine that are deeply engaged in it, that the explosion in the caregiver world, and caregiver conferences, caregiver associations, caregiver conference, all sorts of advisories, etc. And I just wonder, because you mentioned it, how much you find are companies interacting with those caregiver groups and then trying to, whether do formal or informally understand what drives caregivers that much? Because it seems to me like it's just an exploding area in the healthcare space.
Yeah, it very much depends on the therapeutic area. I mean, absolutely in, sort of elderly care, oncology,
yeah,
like that, where, a caregiver will be involved, but equally so, there's a lot of, a lot of treatments where, a caregiver doesn't necessarily have a role. But absolutely, I mean, caregivers in some categories are the primary target audience. Any sort of direct-to-consumer, sort of patient education type work, it is the caregiver that's the primary source. I think the other interesting trend is sort of a rise in market research that's that's looking at sort of almost a CSR angle. It's almost like, yeah, we've got the product and the product treats a certain disease, but what more can we do as a pharma company to add value to communities or patient groups or healthcare professionals above and beyond the product and what it does and treats. So we're seeing a little bit of research money going into how can we build a meaningful role through some sort of CSR.
Right. Yeah. And with that, it's sort of, I guess I should ask, or one of us should have asked the obvious question about market research in terms of, you mentioned early on that market research in the pharma world is sort of like declined in terms of the volume or whatever. There's not the budgets, etc. So what about the actual people doing the market research? Is it an area where you find it's better to do with people that are very specialized in that area, and are there enough of them? How does that work?
No, absolutely. In my view, you've got to work with on one hand, you've got to work with a specialized shop because they have the physician contacts. I mean, getting recruitment is a big can be a challenge. If you're commissioned to recruit 10 oncology patients or 10 patients with some sort of life-threatening condition or a very sensitive sort of sexual health issue, that is a challenge. And also with healthcare professionals, recruiting a representative group that are not going to be biased in their views. So the recruitment requires a lot of specialism, but also the way in which research is conducted with the healthcare professional or with the patient, the sensitivity that's required in dealing with some of these types of topics. Having said that, I have seen occasions where clients have a little bit sick and tired, perhaps, of not having enough innovation in the way the market research is conducted, and you'll occasionally see a consumer agency invited to the table where, they almost benefit from their naivety by recommending maybe more innovative ways of getting under the skin of a healthcare professional or a patient in a sensitive area. But by and large, you'd want a specialist shop. There are a number of specialist shops that have been here for many years, working either offshoots of sort of multinational market research companies or small specialist units just specialize in that area.
Do you see AI and social media and other? I mean, it's in marketing research, as you probably know. In general, it's tech nonstop, and for good reason. It's having we've experienced many changes in the way we go about our business, and that the pace of change is accelerating. Now, in your area, how does all that tech, quote unquote, thinking very generally, how is that fitting in, and where do you think it's going to take marketing, medical marketing?
Yeah, I think it's got as much of a role in healthcare as it has in any other category. But I would probably say, the traditional methods, still have a role, and we've got to be doing a better job there as well. I mean, tech will help. It'll help with recruitment. It'll help with a more comfortable way, perhaps, to have certain types of conversations. Obviously looking at social media in terms of exchange of opinions and reviews and using that as a form of insight and research. I think the agility that tech may provide, I mean, often doctors are busy people, and getting them down to a focus group or to an IDI can be challenging, but maybe through some sort of online mechanism they'll be more available, more willing to participate. That's beneficial. I think some of the basics haven't been used effectively, like webcam eye tracking, or on packaging or on advertising, UX for websites. I mean, some of the basic stuff isn't being used as well as it should be. I think where there's huge opportunity for gain is in things like advanced analytics and sort of dashboards and real-time reporting, data visualization, These types of areas, I think, would be hugely beneficial. But I'm just not sure that the basics are being done as well as they could be.
I think that's generally a trend that many veterans in marketing research have spotted. That you have a lot of, like, to use a crude analogy, it's like you have like a young kid who wants to do an overhead kick, a bicycle kick, but they don't know the rules of the game yet.
Yeah.
They don't know how to trap the ball, and they're going to get hurt. So it's not good. But yeah, I could go on and on and on. But we have unfortunately, some tech can only take us so far. We don't have a time machine here. So I'm going to have to turn this back over to Dave. Do you have anything else you'd like to?
Well, yeah, I want to do a little shout out and get a response from Graeme, because we're recording this on November 19th. And for those listeners that don't know, November 19th is World Toilet Day, which is a cause that I've done some work with and continue to talk about toilets endlessly, it seems. And I know a lot of people think it's a way of me just to joke around on stage, but it's actually something I think is really important. So, Graeme, World Toilet Day, there's about 1 billion people in the world that don't have access to a toilet at all. Only about just over 50% of the world's population actually have a toilet inside their home. And I'm just wondering, if you've got any thoughts about, I know I've sprung it on you, but thoughts about toilets and health and the relationship.
Well, look, I've seen the presentation several times, and look, I think it's a great play of, you've got some humor in there to bring, I guess, to attract audience attention, but the message underpinning that story is incredibly serious. I think, having done a lot of work in the developing world, you're absolutely right. I think, sanitation and the absence of toilets is a major health issue. And I think, raising awareness of what, the developed world takes for granted, and the dire need in the developing world is incredibly important. So look, I'm a full supporter of that. But what's the question, Dave, in terms of?
Well, when you look around all the work you've done, I'm always interested in the way in which, my point about toilets is that we all take it for granted. Most of us have had an indoor toilet our whole lives. I didn't when I was very young, but that's an exception in Australia. And, we, the three of us, most of our listeners can't imagine a life without a toilet.
Right.
And as you say, when it gets down to the basics of the health and health marketing and et cetera, we get carried away sometimes about, the most advanced new drug, et cetera, but it's really about the basics of public health. And I know you've done some work with public health issues and stuff like that. So it was more, just a general comment about the importance of those things and how do you go about understanding what's really important in terms of public health and those sorts of things in people's health lives?
Yeah, look, I think looking at what, the toilet issue, from what I understand of it, it's an issue of access. And maybe there's a component of sort of education and understanding and utilisation. In other words, if there's a toilet there and people aren't using it, then there's an issue of sort of educating the populace of the importance of a toilet. But, my basic understanding of that predicament is access, if I'm not mistaken. And that's all around, funding infrastructure that builds toilets for communities and things like that. My assumption is that people would probably use them. I could be wrong. But then I guess in public health, there's that whole other area where access is available, but it's not taken up. I mean, vaccination would be a very interesting example there, where you have access to vaccines and yet you have communities that don't, for one reason or another, take the vaccine up, assuming access has been sorted out. And there's a variety of ways in on that. I think if I could just give one most recent example of a really interesting approach in Afghanistan, is a very high infant mortality rate. So 1 child in 10 will die from a vaccine-preventable disease. And there's been education programs and work done to try and understand why that is the case. And a nice little bit of insight work a couple of years ago unveiled the fact that these are migratory populations, and as a result, they move from one place to another. And the basic problem is that doctors don't know what vaccine that child has had. So there's no sort of vaccination cards, there's no record. The other insight was that when the child is born, they get a bracelet put on to their arm with little beads on, which is a symbol of protection. So there we had a lovely marriage between, I guess, 2 findings. Was we need a vaccination record, and we need to sort of emphasize the role of vaccination in terms of protecting the infant. So there's a nice idea developed called the immunity charm, which is a little bottles of beads of different colors representing different vaccines that doctors would use on the bracelet every time the child had a vaccination. So when they move from one community to another, the doctor in that new community could see immediately which vaccines the child had or had not had. And the mother also was reminded every time she saw the bracelet of this sort of symbol of protection. And the idea being that the more beads the child has, the better, and the more protected they are. So, you know, understanding the deep-rooted reasons why the behavior is not being done, and again, through research, can be incredibly helpful in these types of situations. I don't know if that answers your question, Dave.
But I remember that. I remember that that campaign, and you're talking about that elsewhere. And a great example of getting people's behaviour to change by finding an insight into what's really important in their lives that they do hold as important, and how to marry that into something that we think they should find more important and get them together. Really good example.
It's all about, you know, what is the meaningful role the brand or the service can provide, and you know, I think, and you know, getting clients, and particularly pharma clients, to appreciate that just because you've got what appears to be a great product doesn't necessarily mean it has a meaningful role yet in the life of the target audience. So, likewise with toilets. I mean, I would imagine, Dave, you know, once there'll be some communities you build the toilets and no one uses them, perhaps.
Yeah.
What's the
I mean, I think one of the things that we found, or the research I've seen, is that, you know, going back, particularly in cultures where it hasn't existed before, and open defecation was seen as the norm, and in some cases, the resistance will be that, particularly for men, literally gathering around a plot of land and doing your business in the evening is a way to socialise. And so, you know, there's all sorts of social barriers to the uptake of it. But you've sometimes got to figure out ways to marry what is going to be the great social advantage, the greater social advantage of using these things.
Well, on that delightful note, I think we're probably
we're done.
I think that's the perfect way to close this very fascinating discussion. Thank you again, Graeme, for joining us. That's been very enlightening. Right to the end.
Well, thanks, Graeme. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks, Dave and Kevin, for the opportunity to join you guys. Great chat. And look, I appreciate your interest in healthcare and healthcare market research.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, gents.
Bye.